I want to bring in Mike Memoli, who is handling and reporting for us today on the Hunter Biden case, which is far different in every aspect. Mike, what do we know?
Well, Jose, a potentially significant development as we're getting information really up to the minute from our team inside the courtroom, who is relaying a bit of tension inside the courtroom. One of the big questions when this plea agreement was announced a month ago was whether this really amounted to the end of the U.S. attorney here in Delaware's investigation into Hunter Biden. At the time, the U.S. attorney did put out a statement indicated that the investigation was continuing, which there was a lot of questions about at the moment. One of those questions is now being asked by Judge Mary Ellen Noreika herself, who did ask the prosecutorial team in the courtroom if there is indeed a continuing investigation into Hunter Biden. The prosecutorial team indicated yes, and the judge expressed some frustration about that, essentially asking, and I'm paraphrasing here, Jose, why are we undergoing this process today involving pleas and a probation agreement if there are potentially additional charges, additional facts that may come to light here? So that is the latest information we have, and we don't have a resolution of that line of questioning just yet, but it does indicate here why this may not be the end of Hunter Biden's legal woes, at least as it relates to this particular investigation here, Jose.
I want to bring in Barbara McQuaid again. So, Barbara, can you, and I know this is just happening as we're, speaking, but again, what does this mean?
Well, it is an interesting thing that David Weiss has said that the investigation remains ongoing. And so I suppose the judge is saying, well, if it's ongoing, why are we resolving it here? But that happens from time to time. The judge may ask questions, but it's ultimately the prosecutor who gets to decide whether to go forward. It may be that there are other crimes that are being investigated. It may be that there are other people being investigated. Or it may be that they want to keep this open during the period that Hunter Biden is on pretrial diversion to let him know that they mean business, and if he fails to fulfill the conditions of the pretrial diversion, that he will indeed be charged. But that's part of her job, to ask questions and for the prosecutors to take the position that they want to take. So again, I expect that she will accept the guilty plea, but take the plea agreement under advisement while she learns more about all of the details and the facts of the investigation.
Garrett Hake, Mike Memoli, and Barbara McQuaid, thank you for being with us this morning. Up next, breaking news in New York City, a crane collapsing, dropping 40 stories onto a busy street. Take a look at it. There it is. The moment it collapses. We're going to bring you the very latest next. You're watching Jose Diaz-Balart Reports on MSNBC.
Court both
offers a wide variety of engaging courses, and our teachers and advisors are with you every step of the way. What makes Estravo different? Our people, real people who care about you. Let's achieve your goals together. You and Estravo. Visit estravo.org and enroll today.
And we have breaking news in the Hunter Biden hearing. Let's go right to NBC's Tom Winter, who just ran outside of the court. What do you have, Tom?
Well, right now, the United States Department of Justice and the son of the President of the United States, Robert Hunter Biden, have no deal. That's what was just stated in court. Both sides are taking a 10-minute recess right now to see if they can agree to terms on the plea agreement. Starting about 11 a.m., the judge started to question whether or not a provision in the agreements, this pretrial diversion on the gun charge, and as well, and we're just finding this out now, and I ask the audience patience with this because we haven't been able to see these court documents today, but apparently as part of the pretrial diversion agreement for the gun charge that Hunter Biden faces, there are additional tax charges that are covered in that, meaning that they won't be brought should he abide by the terms of that pretrial diversion agreement. The judge questions that and says, look, the pretrial diversion agreement is outside of my purview, but yet it's referenced in the plea agreement, between the two parties. And she questioned the government and said, you're asking me to approve and accept this plea agreement, but yet I've got this pretrial diversion that's hanging out there. And is it your understanding, Hunter Biden, that, you know, if there's some sort of a break in the agreement here, are you willing to still move forward as far as the difference between the pretrial diversion agreement and the plea agreement? Hunter Biden said, no, Your Honor. The two sides meet at exactly 11 a.m. Chris Clark, who represents Hunter Biden, goes over to the prosecution. The judge took a 10-minute recess there, and he said, and this is a quote, "We'll rip it up. We'll tear up this agreement right then." The two sides got back together again after that 10, 15-minute recess and said, look, we agree now that the pretrial diversion is separate from all of this. And with respect to the plea agreement, the only reason why we reference this pretrial diversion agreement is just to say that when you cut to sentencing guidelines, which is this idea of what eventually sentence Hunter Biden should get for the misdemeanor tax offenses, that you can't include the gun charge into that. Everything seemed to be okay at that point, but then the judge asked, look, there's an ongoing investigation here. Government says yes, they agree. They say, what does that ongoing investigation involve? They say they can't talk about it. And they said, okay, so you're asking me to accept a plea agreement, but does that cover any potential charges? And she referenced the work that Hunter Biden has done for entities in foreign countries. And she said, does this preclude you from bringing FARA charges in the future if I accept this plea agreement? And the government said, no, we could bring those charges. The defense, Chris Clark, acting on behalf of Hunter Biden, disagreed with that and said, no, that's not my understanding of the agreement. And then the federal prosecutor said, there's no deal. That was at 11:31. And Chris Clark, who represents Hunter Biden, says, as far as I'm concerned, the plea agreement is null and void. Just as I left the courtroom itself, the judge determined that there should be a 10-minute recess to try and figure out whether or not the two parties can quickly come to an agreement. Otherwise, the trial clock is on. As I was leaving the courtroom, she was talking about status conferences, future filings, as if there was no plea agreement at all, as if the very reason why we were here today does not exist. So as I stand here, I'm just looking at my clock to make sure, watch rather, that they're not back in. As I stand here, there is no current plea deal between the Justice Department and the son of the president. That's where we stand.
So, Tom, kind of listening into all of this. So you're talking about something that happened 8 minutes ago. If the judge did a 10-minute pause there, we're talking about right now, they should any minute now be coming back in and discussing this issue. But as of right now, that agreement, that deal, that agreement is null and void?
As of right now, both parties have agreed that the deal terms that they've worked out, the plea agreement that they've worked out, does not exist. Now, could in the time that I've been explaining to you, Jose, what has happened here this morning, that they could have come to new terms, that they could talk about it, that they could come to some sort of an agreement in front of the judge, all that could be happening literally as I sit here and speak to you. But as of the moment I left the courtroom, a little after 11:31, the plea agreement is out. And I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions. I'd like to get back into the court overflow room. I can't get back into the main room, but I'd like to get back into the court overflow room, report back to you all, and let you know if we have a resolution.
Tom, go do that. I thank you very much. Literally second by second, this is changing. I thank you for your coverage, Tom. Barbara McQuaid is still with us. Barbara, again, is this not unusual upon unusual?
I would say it's unusual because usually the parties are very prepared about what they're agreeing to and what they're not agreeing to. But I think this is probably likely a hiccup. It is unusual that you would have these sort of two different agreements going on at the same time. And it sounds like the judge here is looking out for the interests of Hunter Biden. She wants to make sure that he's not agreeing on the one hand to this deal where he gets probation, and then the government is going to sort of backdoor him by continuing to investigate other crimes and spring those on him when he thinks he's resolving the whole case today. Normally, the language that gets included in a plea agreement goes something like this. The government agrees not to prosecute the defendant for any other crimes of which it is currently aware. And that protects the government in case they find out that this person, in Detroit, we always said, kidnapped and murdered Jimmy Hoffa. If we find out something, we don't want to be bound that we can never bring them a case against them again, or if they commit some crime in the future, we want the ability to be able to prosecute them. So we say anything of which we are currently aware, this resolves it. And so I don't know whether that language is in this plea agreement, but I imagine that as they go back to their respective sides, they will work to see if that is something that they can agree to. Because a defendant should not take that leap of faith that there won't be more charges that come down the pike. So I think the judge here is being very cautious to look out for the interests of Hunter Biden, and his lawyer does not want to proceed unless he gets those kinds of assurances. Certainly a fairer case could be brought later down the road, but if the government already knows about it and the parties have discussed it, then that should be off the table at this point.
And so, and I'm just wondering if indeed they can't get to any kind of agreement on this, and we're talking about, so what you were saying, that right now, I mean, we're 42 after, it should be about the time that they're back in the courtroom or, having discussed this. I'm just wondering, what are the steps, what's the process if there is a break in an agreement, during the actual case? What happens next?
I would imagine the prosecution would go back and regroup, but the charges they would bring would likely be more serious than those to which they are allowing a guilty plea. That's typically how it goes. You get a break when you plead guilty, so the stakes could get higher for Hunter Biden. I would imagine they would want to go back and take some time. I don't think this case is going to go to trial in 70 days because the charges that are on the table at the moment are those charges that were filed in contemplation of a guilty plea. So I think the prosecution would go back, reassess, file charges under the most serious readily provable offense, which is the ordinary charging position of the government. And then after those charges are filed, the speedy trial clock would begin. But, if the parties have reached this point, it's clear they both want to resolve it. My guess is if they aren't able to resolve it in the next 10 minutes or so, while the court is in session, they'll go back to their corners and reassess and come up with a resolution that works. I think that the judge here is appropriately looking out for the interests of the defendant, and the government was sort of trying to have his cake and eat it too, but it sounds more semantic than it is substantive, and my guess is they'll be able to work it out eventually.
And so the working out could be a matter of days, not hours or minutes.
It usually gets resolved in minutes or hours. If I were a betting person, I'd say more than 50% likelihood it gets resolved today, but if not, within the next week.
I want to, Barbara, if you'd stay with us, I want to bring in Kelly O'Donnell. Kelly, this is unexpected for many people. It sounded like this was going to be essentially a fait accompli. They were going to go in, agree to what was agreed, and go forward. But is there any reaction from the White House?
Not on the difficulties that have just erupted and the questions that have been injected into this process, but I was reaching out to White House officials who basically said that when the plea agreement was announced, the president and first lady said in a statement at that time that they love their son and they are proud of him for continuing to rebuild his life, and they have expressed support for him through this. What we have typically heard from the White House is that kind of a family, personal connection to Hunter Biden, who is obviously embroiled in what is a public event in terms of a prosecution, but also a political one in that he is so often the subject of conservative criticism and questions that are being raised in the political space. But for the president, apart from the functions of government, he has really cast himself in a way that people can relate to. He is the father of this only surviving son, and he and the First Lady want to express love for his continued work on recovery. Our colleague Mike Memley mentioned that the subject was introduced in court about when was the last time Hunter Biden had been using illegal substances. That is a part of his process going forward. So expressions of support for Hunter Biden as a person, not weighing in on the particulars of the prosecution here. On this matter and on things relating to former President Trump and other subjects, the White House has tried to put as much distance between the president and the function of the White House and the Department of Justice. As today's events unfold, if this is unresolved, that will give us new questions to pose here. But it's mostly been in the personal lane of trying to maintain that family support. We have seen Hunter Biden on campus here at the White House for White House events. He was at the state dinner. He is an active member of the family. He and his wife and their young child and his grown children are a part of the festivities here, whether it was the 4th of July fireworks or a state event or an entertainment performance that happens at the White House. He is visible as a member of this family. And of course, he's a protectee of the Secret Service. So in court today, he's got his protective detail and so forth. So we will watch, as everyone does, what happens here. And I'm not a lawyer, but having covered a lot of these cases, certainly the expectation was how to execute this court appearance with as minimal political pain from the perspective of Hunter Biden, his father, who is now a candidate for re-election, and so forth. This certainly injects some uncertainty, and that, of course, will raise ongoing questions. On Capitol Hill, we've seen how Hunter Biden, his business activities, and so forth have been the focus of criticism. And so if any of that weighs in today, that would not be unexpected. So from the White House point of view, they certainly would have hoped this would go through quietly today in the sense of no surprises. Instead, we do have some surprises as we wait to figure out if this is a short-term problem or something that's going to go on for a period beyond today. Jose?
A surprise indeed, Kelly. I want to bring back Mike Memley in Delaware. And Mike, we were just speaking with Tom, who was inside there, just talking about how really at 11:31 there was a statement that there was no deal. Is this something that was clearly unexpected by the Hunter Biden folks?
Well, this certainly seems to be a surprise because simply the idea of a plea agreement, you would expect that both the prosecutors and the defense attorneys have dotted all the I's, crossed all the T's, and are in full agreement about what proceeds. And the beginning of an indication that things were potentially heading in a different direction today was when Hunter Biden himself was questioned about whether these two separate tranches of charges in which he was pleading about today, one, the federal tax charges, the failure to pay federal taxes, and second, the gun possession charge, were essentially linked. Would he agree to the terms of these agreements moving forward if they were not linked? And Hunter Biden indicated no, that he was entering into this agreement under the assumption that these were linked. So that was complication number one. Complication number two has to do with what the U.S. Attorney's team did state in public in the courtroom itself, which is that there is still an ongoing investigation and whether that would then lead to potential further charges. So as we understand it at the moment, there was a 10-minute break in which potentially both sides could get back on the same page here, maybe agree to the rule of the road moving forward. But there's also a discussion of whether there needs to be a formal end of today's proceedings and set some new dates down the road while they potentially try to recobble this agreement altogether. Needless to say, this would be a significant setback for Hunter Biden, for the First Family, who had hoped that this was really the beginning of the end, that they would ultimately move in one more step to the formal sentencing process down the road, but then the president would be free to go on about the campaign without the legal cloud hovering over his son. And obviously Hunter Biden himself can go through the terms of the agreement, go into counseling, which was brought up as one of the terms of his probation, agreed to stay off of drugs and alcohol, and move forward to, as the First Family is saying in their statement, continue to rebuild his life. The other thing, though, Jose, which is worth noting here, this was never going to end, at least for the moment. Questions, particularly among Republicans in Congress, about the ways in which the Justice Department has handled this case. In fact, these proceedings, this confusion is likely to only deepen the interest of Republicans on Capitol Hill to bring, for instance, David Weiss, the U.S. Attorney for Delaware, essentially acting as a special prosecutor in this case, to come to testify before Congress. It's going to deepen interest in potentially what may, as Speaker McCarthy has floated, the idea of an impeachment inquiry, whether there are more facts here, if an investigation is still ongoing at the Justice Department level, that should be known to Congress itself. So needless to say that the legal cloud only continuing to grow here, but let's wait until we get more information as the proceeding potentially continues and resolves itself before we get too far down that road, Jose.
Yeah, and I mean, Barbara, I want to bring up the issue that it's so unusual, is it not, that something like not paying your taxes for 2 years would get to a point like we're seeing in the Hunter Biden case.
Yes, that's right, Jose. You know, prosecutors have scarce resources, and so they try to aim at cases that are causing a danger to public safety or public fairness. And so, you know, in my former office, had the resources to bring about 1,000 cases a year across every subject matter. So as a result, if we were going to charge a criminal tax case, we would want to know that it was associated with organized crime or violent crime or massive fraud. Someone who simply evades taxes typically is dealt with civilly. That is, they have to pay the taxes back, the full amount, plus interest, plus penalties, plus fines. That's the way it's typically handled. And so to see Hunter Biden being charged criminally for these strikes me as more harsh than usual. Now, it may be that this is a compromise and that there are other things that they're looking at here, like was mentioned, FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, where someone is acting as an agent of a foreign country and has failed to obtain permission from the Attorney General to do that or to notify the Attorney General that they're doing that. So we don't know that in the public domain, but if that is what is underlying some of these crimes, then a tax charge might be a way through compromise that the parties resolve the case.
So this Foreign Agent Registration Act, is that also a violation of that and make it a criminal offense?
Yes, it can be. It's it's one that's not brought all that often, but it is a serious crime. If someone is, for example, there were allegations that Mike Flynn was acting as an agent of the government of Turkey when he wrote an op-ed in a newspaper in the United States suggesting it was his own opinion when in fact it had been ghostwritten for him by a foreign government. And that's because people from the United States read and respect that a fellow citizen wrote something. If instead you were put up to it by a foreign agent, then the public has a right to know that you are working as that agent, perhaps as a paid agent. And so if someone is lobbying on behalf of a foreign government, that should be disclosed and that can be charged as a criminal offense. So I don't know that there's any evidence that Hunter Biden has done it. I just raise it because that was a question that was asked during this plea hearing about whether the government might be pursuing charges for other crimes, including a violation of FARA.
And Mike Beverly, this plea hearing this morning was, for many people, something that was going to happen pretty routinely in a couple of hours.
Yeah, that's right, Jose. We were expecting this to last potentially only as long as 2 hours. The only question of whether it would go on longer had to do with that filing from Capitol Hill Republicans who were seeking to basically call attention to the judge of the possibility that there should be more serious charges brought to bear here. There was an agreement earlier in this proceeding on the part of both Hunter Biden's defense team as well as the prosecutors that no, more serious charges, at least as it relates to the tax and the gun issue, should be brought in this case. But obviously this later setback, as the judge was really stress testing this plea agreement, probing, asking questions about the terms and what happens next, has led to this longer delay. I think an indication of the surprise that we are in this moment is the fact that we had been getting the indication that Hunter Biden was looking for an opportunity not just to do what we had seen already, which is speak in the courtroom itself, but then speak with reporters afterwards, an indication of the fact that they believed that this was a process that was ending, that could be put in the rearview mirror. Now the question of whether we will hear from Hunter at all, if there is still an ongoing case, if there's still a new need for negotiations between his legal team and the government, or whether the government proceeds on its own, would put that in jeopardy as well.
So, Mike, just to be clear, there was an understanding that Hunter Biden, after his meeting in Delaware, would have something to say?
That's right. We had been given indications from Hunter Biden's legal team that he would look for an opportunity to speak with those of us gathered outside of here after. But obviously, everything I would say is up in the air at the moment. We'll call into question. We'll see if that proceeds, if and when we get a sense of how this is potentially being resolved as we speak behind closed doors.
Mike Beverly, I thank you very much. And Kelly, I'm just wondering if there is any understanding of any communication or kind of coordination between what Hunter Biden was expected to do today and the White House.
They have tried to keep distance, and certainly on that personal level, I think it's entirely possible that the president and his son might speak by phone. They speak all the time. The president always makes a point that he speaks to all of his grandchildren every day, and so there could be that level of communication. But from the White House, as an entity and an organization, they have kept a distance from this because they have said that the matter should be held and dealt with separately. Obviously, Hunter Biden has his own counsel and so forth. So in this place at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, he's a first son more than an extension of the administration. Politically, people often see that as him as a target politically. But the president has no public events on his schedule today. He is here. We do expect a White House briefing with Karine Jean-Pierre. I'm sure she will get questions on this, but typically she refers those questions either to the White House counsel's office spokesperson team or to the private counsel for Hunter Biden who are with him in Delaware. And certainly many people in Delaware thought they'd have a train ticket back to D.C. today, and that now is an open question about when this will be resolved and how quickly it will move forward. Jose?
And Barbara McQuaid, just to recap on this, just the fact that there was a no deal statement made in the courtroom today doesn't necessarily mean, Barbara, that this is a no deal going forward permanently.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, Jose, my guess is that the parties will go back and hammer out language and be able to resolve it. Once you get to this stage, both sides want to resolve it. They've made a decision that they think the substance of this deal is what they want to achieve. And so if the language is hanging them up, and it sounds like that's the issue here, I'm sure that that can be resolved. So if the judge has time on her docket, maybe she'll hear it today. If she doesn't, it can be rescheduled for some time later down the road.
Barbara McQuaid and Kelly O'Donnell, thank you so much for being with us this morning. That wraps up the hour for me. I'm Jose Diaz-Balart. Thank you for the privilege of your time. Up next, Andrea Mitchell said
that he
Good day, everyone. I'm Andrea Mitchell in New York. Breaking news from Delaware, where Hunter Biden's guilty plea agreement to avoid further penalties on tax evasion and diverting a separate gun offense is now in jeopardy. House Republicans had said all along that the president's son was receiving special treatment with a so-called sweetheart deal and had been running their own investigation into Hunter Biden's business practices, in fact, challenging the way the case was prosecuted. The prosecutor strongly denied, and he was appointed by Donald Trump. Held over, in fact, by the White House just to try to avoid any appearance of interference. Republicans have also accused the president of being involved in his son's business dealings, something the White House strongly denies. But some Republicans are now using that to press for an impeachment inquiry. Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli outside the courthouse in Delaware. Also with us, former U.S. Attorney Paul Charlton and Philip Rucker, who has just been named as the next national editor of the Washington Post, which is a huge deal, and on any other day, Phil, that would be our lead story. We're going to have to leave with what's just happened in that courtroom in Delaware. So, Tom, first to Mike Memoli, I think, walk us through this last-minute drama. Why is the plea deal falling apart?
Well, Andrea, what's happening right now in this courthouse behind me will really, at this moment, determine whether this deal proceeds as expected or whether this does indeed fall apart. Let's walk through what was supposed to happen and what were the complications. Hunter Biden, the president's son, was agreeing, as part of that plea agreement announced last month, to plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor charges related to a failure to pay his taxes in 2017 and 2018, and then separately to go into what's known as a pretrial diversion program in response to his acknowledging that he purchased a firearm without acknowledging truthfully that he was not under the influence of drugs or at the moment. And so what was the first complication as this proceeding went on this morning was whether those 2 agreements were effectively linked. Would Hunter Biden agree to one without the other? Hunter, under questioning from Judge Mary Ellen Norica, who is leading this proceeding, indicated that he would not have agreed to one without the other and that they needed to be linked. There was some disagreement about whether that was in fact the proceeding here. But the more serious complication really boils down to whether the case that was being prosecuted, whether the investigation by the U.S. Attorney here in Delaware had concluded, whether this agreement today represented the closure, the finality of their investigation, or whether there could be future charges on separate and potentially related issues involving his business dealings that could come down the road. When the prosecutorial team was questioned by the judge about that fact, they indicated, yes, that this investigation is ongoing. The judge really asked some questions at that point, saying, why are we going through this proceeding at the moment if there could be further charges down the road? Hunter Biden's legal team expressing some questions about that at the same time, where they were under the impression here that they were agreeing to these terms with the express intent of bringing this to a conclusion. So there was a 10-minute recess, as we understood it, that was underway, in which the prosecutors and the defense attorneys were going to try and get back on the same page. But if, in fact, they are able to come back, really dot those I's I's and cross those T's, then we could proceed as planned. But at the moment, as it was stated in the courtroom itself, this plea agreement that was announced last month is no longer in effect.
And Mike, just to follow up here, because the White House was hoping to finally get this out of the way. Not that it would get it out of the way, because they're now talking about impeachment on related unspecified issues. But even though there was going to still be the political shadow hanging over all of this, certainly among House Republicans, they thought that they would get the legal thing out of the way. And now, if they can't come to an agreement quickly, this thing is still going to be hanging over their heads, Mike.
Yeah, not only is it going to be a significant complication for this president as he runs for a second term and continues about the business of his administration, to have his son's legal woes, at least as it relates to the government itself, continuing, but it's only going to add more fuel to the political fire that Republicans were stoking on Capitol Hill as they move forward with a potential impeachment charge. Remember, they wanted to see the U.S. attorney here in Delaware. We should remind everyone, a Trump appointee who was agreed by President Biden to stay in his post because of his role in investigating his own son. That they wanted to hear from him about why more serious charges were not being brought. So this is only further, potentially even in the views of the Republican, legitimizes their investigation, their contention that this was an indication of interference by the president into the conduct of the Justice Department. But potentially, more significantly, remember, Andrea, Hunter Biden was front and center in the 2020 campaign. The impeachment of the former president, Donald Trump, began with his efforts and the efforts of his allies to allege that Vice President Biden had engaged in some wrongdoing because of his son's involvement in business dealings. So just as in 2020, when Hunter Biden was part and parcel of a discussion in legal potential overhanging then candidate Joe Biden, this now further complicates that as we head into 2024, Andrea.
Paul Charlton, I've got so many questions. So Mike and I both need a lawyer to understand all of the intricacies of this, but all along, not only the prosecutor, the Trump prosecutor in Delaware had been held over while all the other U.S. attorneys have been asked for their resignations, as is traditional when a new president takes over, as you know. That prosecutor had said, and others have said, other outside attorneys have said, I should say, that Hunter Biden on these tax penalties was actually facing a tougher legal procedure than another person not named Biden would, you know, who had paid the back taxes plus interest and penalty. This indicates that this deal and this whole issue is a lot more serious, or does it?
It does indeed, and it represents an extraordinary failing to communicate in some fashion.
Right.
Sometimes, Andrea, plea agreements fall apart. Sometimes you'll be in court, and in my 16 years as a prosecutor, this happens from time to time, and there's a misunderstanding about exactly what the plea agreement is. There'll be a recess. The parties will come back together, hopefully after having clarified that misunderstanding. But the misunderstanding here seems very fundamental. Is this the end of the prosecution, or is there an ongoing prosecution? Remember that in his press release, the U.S. attorney in charge of this matter said that this matter, this case, this investigation is ongoing. For there to be a misunderstanding in court today is an extraordinary development. The judge asked the right questions. Is this the end of the investigation? And when the parties had a disagreement, Mr. Biden's lawyers saying, no, we believe this is the end of the investigation, the prosecutor saying the investigation is ongoing, there's a failure there. There's a fundamental misunderstanding that is, in and of itself, extraordinary. And whether or not the parties can ever bridge that disagreement, we'll just have to see.
Now, let me follow up on that, because I remember when he issued that press release and said that there was an ongoing investigation, and we were all asking questions about it. And understandably, you know, the defense felt that this was the end of it. But if there was any questions, since we were asking the questions, why weren't they saying, what do you mean this is not the end of our case? I mean, it just seems to me that this is the kind of misunderstanding or lack of communication that would have been cleared up before they arrived in court before a judge today, Paul.
Precisely, and in plea agreements that have fallen apart, in my experience in the past, they don't involve such fundamental issues. Am I done with this investigation, or is the investigation still ongoing? That kind of failure to communicate or to understand is unusual, and where that breakdown in communication took place, we can't say or know exactly, except that in defense of the prosecutors, it was in their very press release. So that's unusual, and the judge was trying to get to the bottom of why are we entering into a plea agreement today that will resolve the tax and the gun issue if there is an ongoing investigation. And the parties apparently hadn't fully discussed or understood the answer to that question. That's an embarrassment. To whom it is that embarrassment falls, the government, the prosecutors, or the defense attorneys, we don't yet know. But it is extraordinarily unfortunate for everyone involved that on a case with this kind of high profile, this sort of failing would take place.
Phil Rucker, you're going to earn your stripes as the incoming national editor here to make sense of all of this, because politically, this could not be worse for the White House. Trying to, put this off to a side, say it's the son, he's paid his dues, he's gone through rehab. Every family has a troubled member. Everyone can relate to this. The middle class person that we're appealing to can relate to it. I mean, you've heard it, I've heard it, and it resonates to all of us. Yet, here they are with this overshadowing them in an election year, going into an election year.
Exactly, Andrea. Our team at the Post is certainly going to be trying to figure out exactly what is going on at the Justice Department in terms of this investigation, which, as you noted, was said to have been ongoing a few weeks ago when this plea deal was announced. But this is a huge political headache for President Biden just at the moment when the presidential campaign is beginning to intensify. Mike alluded to the pressure from House Republicans on Capitol Hill to continue looking into Hunter Biden, to scrutinize the FBI and the Justice Department for how they have investigated Hunter Biden the last few weeks in the alleged sweetheart deal as Republicans see it. But this is just all going to continue to be pretty murky territory for the president as he really hopes to put this all in his rearview mirror and focus on the re-election campaign.
There was even some speculation, and it was just speculation, that we were waiting for the potential indictment. We'll be talking about that in just a few minutes. The potential indictment on the major case, the federal case of trying to overturn the election against Donald Trump. And that there was some thought that, well, even though he received a target letter last week, they were going to wait until this got all cleared away so that, they would not have that distraction, at least politically. I guess Jack Smith doesn't think about politics, but someone does. In any case, that's another whole issue. Mike and Emily, let's talk about the White House, because for them, this is really a mess, to use a legal term, because they've got high-priced lawyers, well-known lawyers, we know all of them, and this, you would think that when the prosecution put out that news release that they got some clarification about what the ongoing investigations were, presumably some business arrangements that did not involve either the taxes or the gun offense, correct?
Well, first, we should talk about the White House reaction in terms of the familial reaction of a president and the First Lady as it relates to their son. They were looking at this as the beginning of the end of a long process of recovery for their son. Remember, the son's, Hunter Biden's own admission of his battles with substance abuse and addiction begin with the death of his brother, Beau, in 2015. These tax charges stem from what he acknowledged again in court today was an addiction that continued until 2019. And so this was the hope, and in the public statements we've received from the White House, again, an indication of they support their son and they're proud of their son. And so they are certainly looking at this first and foremost through that lens. On the part of the White House team, though, more broadly, as they look ahead as well to a re-election campaign, I think this will only exacerbate tensions that we at NBC News have been reporting about between the president's own team and Hunter Biden's legal team. Abby Lowell, somebody who was brought on more recently into this process, a high-profile lawyer in Washington to be sure, but there was a sense among some of the president's advisors that he was taking the way he handled this case, both legally and in terms of public opinion and trying to shape public opinion in a direction that was not necessarily aligned with the president's political interests. And so to the degree that there is a miscommunication, a failure to understand on the part of Hunter Biden's legal team exactly what they were entering into, the potential, the fact that this might, in their view, have been the end, but in the view of the government was just an interim step, that will certainly only inflame the sense in the White House that Hunter Biden was not necessarily getting the best both legal and political advice here.
And Paul Charlton, so is this potentially the start or the end of Hunter Biden's legal troubles?
It's certainly a worse day for Mr. Biden than it is for the prosecution. A bad day for everyone in court today. But Mr. Biden now has a clarification, if ever there was real confusion, that this is an ongoing investigation. Whatever deal he hoped to achieve, whatever bargain he hoped to receive from these misdemeanor tax charges and the pretrial diversion for the gun case, that has been removed. And so now there is an ongoing investigation. How broad that one is, the weight of the evidence that one may reveal at the end of the day, we don't know. But whatever resolution Hunter Biden was hoping to receive today, that's no longer on the table. So that's certainly a bad day for him. And whoever it is that miscommunicated this idea, whoever it is that failed to understand that this investigation was ongoing when there was so much publicity about that very fact, someone's going to have to answer for that eventually, whether that's to Hunter Biden himself by his lawyers or by the prosecutors who failed to communicate that adequately.
And I have one follow-up here, which is, would there be an option if they decide to take this chance, if they realize now that they can't settle everything today, to separate it, which is something they didn't agree to before that break, separate the tax from the gun? Is there any option from what you saw from this courtroom today to settle one of them and not the other, and then also have to deal with the ongoing investigation?
I suspect the opportunity to resolve the tax and gun charges are not removed. But in typical prosecution practice, deals get worse for the defendant as you move forward in time, not better. So it wouldn't be unusual for the defense attorneys to go back to the prosecutors and say, can we still achieve what we wanted to achieve in court today? And for the prosecutors to say, yes, but there'll be a greater cost to you. We'll just have to see now what happens, and I suspect there's going to be a fair amount of discussion about how it is a high-profile, highly publicized, important case like this one fell apart because of a basic misunderstanding of so important an issue as whether or not an investigation was ongoing.
Mike Memoli, let's talk again, you and Phil Rucker. Let me bring Phil in first, actually, about the politics of this, related to the possibility of a Trump indictment and how they were trying to deal with that, as well as put to bed this impeachment inquiry. Phil?
Yeah, Andrea, the first thing to be clear about is the Justice Department separates these investigations. So the Hunter Biden probe has been taking place under the leadership of the U.S. Attorney in Delaware, whereas the Trump investigation's been a special counsel probe led by Jack Smith, and you know, they have maintained through Justice Department sort of norms and practices to not let the kind of politics or timing of the two influence one another. That being said, they're all playing out in the same political landscape and on the same calendar here, and certainly you know, there could be some complicated politics if this Biden investigation continues and even intensifies in the weeks ahead, at the same time that we widely expect federal charges to come against President Trump, former President Trump, for his role in trying to overturn the 2020 election. You know, he received that target letter recently, and we expect that indictment any day now, and that certainly will, you know, have an impact on the Republican presidential nomination race, and insofar as it could end up solidifying some support for Trump, as we've seen with these past indictments. But it's just a reminder that the work of federal prosecutors is very much shaping the politics of the moment as the presidential race gets underway.
No, absolutely. I think Garrett Haake, who covers Trump as well as Capitol Hill and is familiar with what's going on with the speaker and impeachment, is with us as well. Garrett, this is, you know, an extraordinary development. It's very rare that a plea deal is rejected by a judge, but the handwriting was on the wall in that press release, which we were all asking about at the time, that this was an ongoing investigation, and we were all saying, what is the ongoing investigation about? And then, of course, the Republicans, as you know and cover them every day, seized on the fact that there are business dealings that they want to investigate, and they're trying to connect it to Joe Biden, the president.
Yeah, that's right, Andrew. I think congressional Republicans and the Republican presidential candidates are going to be tripping over themselves to be talking about this plea deal falling apart and continuing to highlight the Hunter Biden's issues as a way to damage Joe Biden. There was a lot of frustration in Republican circles that the initial announcement of this plea deal didn't get much coverage, didn't get much kind of the deep dive treatment from the national media in a way that the fact that it is now falling apart almost certainly will. I expect to hear a lot about this from Donald Trump on social media, and I suspect this will add fuel to that impeachment inquiry push that we're seeing on Capitol Hill from congressional Republicans. I mean, it's been interesting to watch this House Republican majority approach the Hunter Biden issue, because the investigative committees, the ones that you would really expect to be doing most of the digging on this, whether it be judiciary or oversight or this new weaponization subcommittee, have kind of failed to come up with anything particularly compelling as relates to Hunter Biden. But it was this IRS whistleblower that the Ways and Means, the tax writing committee, produced a couple of weeks ago that's gotten a lot of attention, that's pushed House Republicans to the edge of opening an impeachment inquiry, and an edge I think they're going to be very hard pressed to back off from once they get started. And development like what we're seeing now today, I think is only going to add to that. They want to keep this story in the headlines, even though for now it's entirely about Hunter Biden. The hope springs eternal among Republican elected officials and would-be elected officials that somewhere they will find a proper nexus to Joe Biden that they can use against him in 2024.
Brendan Buck, Garrett, is also with us, who, as you know well, worked with two previous speakers. What do you think, Brendan, about not only this development, but how it fuels what Kevin McCarthy's been trying to do to get some, momentum behind under pressure from certainly the right-wing members of his caucus to start an impeachment inquiry, something that is not very popular with the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at this situation in two ways. I mean, the House Republicans were alleging that Hunter Biden was let off the hook on his foreign business dealings, and I think now we know that's not necessarily the case, and you would think that may take some wind out of their sails, but I imagine they're going to look at it quite differently. They're going to say, aha, look, Hunter Biden is still being investigated for these business dealings, and as long as this is hanging out there, they're going to continue banging that drum. I mean, I think ultimately, even if no further charges are brought, they'll return right to that allegation that there must be something fishy going on here. But, the white whale for them is the idea that Hunter Biden was involved in some type of illegal business deals on behalf of foreign governments, and Joe Biden was involved. I think they will now try to make the argument that possibility is still alive if there is an active investigation. So all of this just gets them all more spun up. The more Hunter Biden is in the news for doing potentially illegal acts, the more pressure Kevin McCarthy is going to feel. All of it adds to a state of confusion in the House because, ultimately, if you're going to bring articles of impeachment, there need to be clear evidence to back those up. And then I think, as has been noted, the clear evidence is a bit lacking. It's very murky. Right now, Republicans are using that murkiness to their advantage, and today certainly only adds to that. But I think House Republicans will take advantage of this in any way they can, and I think the news today is that he is still potentially under investigation for those foreign business deals.
And as you point out, this murkiness adds to that, and in the climate of a campaign, they can analogize, a president trying to overturn an election, which will, in some way be one of the charges. It'll be fashioned into legal charges, but it's the whole issue of a president of the United States refusing to concede an election and going to great lengths, to say nothing of what happened on January 6th, with a president's son being involved in some shady business deals, allegedly, and admitting to, not paying taxes and having an improper gun, lie or a fraudulent comment on a gun application, not admitting his addictions. Any case, we're going to take a rest here. We're going to wait for people to come out of the courtroom because we've got a guest who is perfectly positioned to talk about all of this, a candidate, a former prosecutor, an experienced lawyer. Up next, Chris Christie, the former New Jersey governor, joining us next, right here on Andrea Mitchell Reports, only on MSNBC.